Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? I can sort of see you. Yeah. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am super disappointed not to be there in person. The Ontario Summer Tour is one of my favorite things to do in all of the maple world, and one of the places I've always felt most welcomed. So disappointed not to be there this year, maybe next year. How many of you have a good chunk of red maple in your operations? Can I see a show of hands? I don't know why I'm ducking under, as if I can like look under the camera. Great. So this presentation has a little bit of something for everyone, whether you have red maple or not. But really the picture that I show up here is really the main question that we're answering and asking here: why red maple? So we'll get into that now. So one of the reasons why to consider red maple is that it has a really large geographic range. So the geographic range of sugar maple is over here on the left, which you can see is fairly limited, just to a little bit south of West Virginia and into North Carolina. But the native range of red maple is actually much more extensive than that. So there's a lot of red maple covering and available to tap, not just in the regions that of the Northeast and northeastern provinces that are really considered for standard for maple production, but they are also prevalent in a lot of areas in the more southern and midwestern regions of maple production. So they're a big geographic range. And within that range, you can find red maple on just about every kind of site that you can imagine. So red maples can be found growing and competing well on sites that are the driest ridgetops to, they can have their feet wet in swampy areas. They really tolerate a lot of conditions and compete well in them. So within that really big range, you also find them on a wide variety of sites. So they're really everywhere. And there are also a lot of red maples available for tapping for maple syrup production that are currently untapped. So this is from work that Dr. Mike Farrell did a number of years ago, looking at the potential taps both of sugar and red maple across the US maple production region. And some of the boxes are places where I've highlighted that there are places where the red maple resource is really pretty substantial and sometimes bigger than the sugar maple resource that's untapped. And these are, places we might not be surprised to see that are places like Kentucky and North Carolina, but places where we might be a little more surprised to see that real abundance of red maple potential taps are places like New York and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania. So really, there's a lot of red maples out there in and near places that can be tapped for maple operations and maple syrup production. So there really a lot of potential out there on the U.S. side, and I know that the same is true in Canada as well. So, and another big reason to consider red maple is that it adds diversity and therefore helps build resilience in our sugar bushes. So this is a great picture that my colleague Mark Islehart took that really highlights just how impactful having a red maple in a sugar bush can be to adding resilience to potential stresses and pests. This is a picture of a sugar maple in the middle here that has been completely defoliated by forest tent caterpillar in Vermont. And what you can see next door to that are two red maples that have been untouched by that forest tent caterpillar. So there can be times when stresses that affect sugar maple, for example, like the forest tent caterpillar, might really impact heavily the sugar maples in a stand. But if there are red maples in that stand, not only are there not all the trees are lost in the stand, but also some of the sap producing trees are still retained in that stand. So it gives not just resilience for the forest, but also resilience for your maple operation. So that's a really important reason to consider keeping and adding and retaining or keeping keeping and retaining red maple as part of our operations. And of course, the big long-term reason is, owing to many of the features of red maple that I mentioned before, it's really adaptable. It's found on a lot of sites and in a big range. As the climate changes across North America, red maple is predicted to actually do really well and much better. It basically predicted to increase in prevalence, especially in the current maple producing regions relative to sugar maple. So it definitely is predicted to do better than sugar maple. So as we move into the future, it's likely that red maple is going to become an even more and more important part of maple production as a result of climate change. So lots of great reasons to consider red maple. But the other flip side of that is like, why am I even making a whole presentation and research project about this? Like, it seems so obvious. But of course, for many of us and across the industry and across time, there have been a lot of lingering perceptions about red maple as somehow an inferior or less than species for maple production. And some of this stems from observations that red maple sap, when you're collecting in buckets, you can often notice that there may be a lower sap sugar concentration. And, in the days where we are not concentrating with RO and we're concentrating that sap purely with heat using mostly wood as a source, well, a small difference in sap sugar concentration is going to make a big difference in how much fuel and how efficient that process is. So that may have translated into the belief that they have overall lower yields than sugar maple. And then we also have some beliefs that kind of hang out about the flavor of syrup made from red maple sap. I know people that will pull their spouts from their red maple trees because they believe that the flavor of red maple sap is going to turn buddy earlier. And then, of course, there's all sorts of people that will say that sap, the red maple sap makes inferior flavored syrup. And then you have the flip side too, of course, that of people saying that red maple makes superior flavored maple syrup. So the big question is, are any of these actually true, particularly with current practices, especially concentrating sap with RO before we get to the evaporator? And because of all the good reasons that red maple can help grow the industry and also add resilience to the forests and in the maple syrup production industry, it was really important to have some hard data to see whether any of these beliefs were actually true. So we started this study to basically provide data to assess those beliefs. So one part of the study was to determine the total yields from red maple trees and also to assess the flavor of syrup produced from red maple sap. So getting into the yield part first, in order to quantify this, pretty simple setup. We had 10 red maple trees, healthy, co-dominant, or dominant, all in the same stand. 10 of each in each of these 5 different diameter classes, everything from 9 to up to 19 inches. And then we also had sugar maples in the same size classes in the same stand. And each of them received a separate sap collection chamber, like you can see here, and you can see my technician Brendan tending to here. So each chamber is under the same vacuum system. We have good vacuum to that system. All the trees get a new check valve spout and are tapped with a 2-inch depth each year. And we repeated the study for 2 years. That's really the minimum for a yield study, because as we know, every year in maple production is different from the other. But basically, it's very simple. Each time the sap runs, we measure the total volume of sap that each tree produces, as well as its sap sugar concentration, so that at the end, we can total up not just the total amount of sap that was produced, but also the total syrup yield produced by each tree. And then we can take all the trees and get averages for each of those diameter classes. Okay, so let's take a look at the results for just 2020, which was an average, decent, pretty good year for us for production. So these are, oops, sorry, my computer is freaking out today. Okay, so these are the data For the red maples, here you can see in each size class, so the average total syrup yield for each of the size classes from 9 up to 19 inches, pardon my English units. And you can see that even for the very small trees, the 9 to 11 inches, our yields for the red maple trees were very good. We had an average of a half gallon of syrup per tap in the smaller trees, up to a gallon of syrup per tap in the larger trees. Now, again, in a chamber study like this, everything is perfect. We have, very tight vacuum. We have really good sanitation, and we are not losing anything in the filter press or on the sugar house floor. So this represents really the total potential of these trees. So it's not surprising to us to see very high yields like this in a chamber study, but it is very affirming to see these high yields for the red maple trees. So how do those compare to the sugar maples in the same stand? So here we're adding the sugar maples in green, and you can see that the yields for the sugar maples were on par with the red maples in the same stand. So they were not significantly different from the yields of the red maples in the same stands of the same size. And if we lump all these together and just look at the total averages for all the size classes, you can see that, again, the red maples and sugar maples are equal to one another. They're not significantly different. And in this case, the yields are pretty good. So over or about 3/4 of a gallon of syrup per tap, US gallons. So not significantly different and really pretty good. So that's a good, a good sign so far. The second year of the study, a couple observations that year. That was 2020. There were obviously some staffing and all sorts of issues related, to getting the study done during those first few months of COVID. So we missed some of the data collection that allows us to look at daily sap yields and daily sap sugar concentration. But we were able to notice some things that also gave us information about, some things that people speculate about red maple. We noticed that the sap flow stopped in both species, both red and sugar maple, at the same time. And in this study, this all happened before we detected any buddy flavor in the neighboring Proctor maple operation. So this gives us some indication that, some indications of some other information about how red maples work relative to sugar maples. But we obviously need another year of data collection for the yields and the other flavor experiment to really make any assessments about flavor. So in 2021, obviously, so you can see here all the way over to the right, 2021 for us, like most everyone else, was a terrible, terrible production year. Too warm, just all sorts of things. And so it was not exactly the best year to do a study to determine the total absolute possible yields from red maple trees. So we were pretty disappointed about this, but because we have sugar maples in the same stand, we can look at those still relative to one another and see how they compared. So again, here's our red maple yields in the different size classes in that second year in 2021. Sorry, I had the wrong, it says 2020, but it's 2021. And obviously, we see the yields for the size classes increase with increasing size, but now we see the averages are much lower than the previous year, no surprise. And the same was true for the sugar maples in the same stand. So yeah, the yields increase with increasing size, as we know, but really not great yields overall. But looking at them together, we can see that, again, even though the yields are overall lower, they are lower for both species, and they're still not significantly different from one another. So to just kind of sum it all up, for the 2 years, we can see in 2020, we had great yields that weren't significantly different. And in 2021, we still have yields that are not significantly different from sugar maple. They're just less good. So in a good year, they're equally good. In a bad year, they were equally bad. So overall, before I get into that conclusion, just to look at a little bit of the daily data. because it does tell us a few things, give us again some more information about how red maples behave with respect to sugar maple. So what you can see here are the total syrup yields for each of the sap flow periods. The red maple is the green line and sugar maple is the red line. So ignore what's in the red boxes. That's when there was ice in the chamber. So that data is a little bit funky, but really what I want to show in this figure is that the two species behave the same. Like when they're not fundamentally producing sap differently from one another. So the pattern of sap flow really mirrors one another in red maple and sugar maple. There's not some gross difference in how they respond to freezing and thawing. And also you can, so, when the flow is high, it's high in both species. When it's low in both species, and it's right tracking along one another. And you can also see that at the end of the season, it tails off and decreases the same. So the red maple is not stopping flow any earlier than the sugar maple, which is for what a lot of people believe about red maples, that they may stop running earlier. We saw no evidence of this in red maple trees in the same stand as the sugar maple trees. And also, I think, hang on, okay. For sap sugar concentration, again, ignore what's in the red box, but we can see here again, red maples in green, sugar maples in purple. So what we can see is that, yes, on average, the sap sugar concentration was higher in sugar maple than red maple, but not as much as we might think. So if you look at the scale here, we're looking at about a 0.2 percentage point difference. So all in all, I mean, yes, there are red maples and sugar maples that produce wildly different sap sugar concentrations because that's affected by a number of different factors for each tree. But on average, it is different, but not maybe as grossly different as we might have in our minds. So that's just something to think about. And again, we see the patterns of the behavior of sap sugar content. Sorry, my light just turned back on. Things are just a little bit weird here. Okay, so sorry. So you can see that the behavior of the sap sugar concentration is the same in both species. So when we had a big freeze event, we see it increase in both species and then decrease and then increase again after a freeze and then decline toward the end of the season. So again, very similar behavior. Okay, so all in all, we've got the fundamental or potential total syrup yields from red maple we can see from these studies are very good. And of course, that is with a caveat, we're using vacuum, good sanitation, and so this is for a vacuum system. And we see that they're not statistically significantly different from the total yield of sugar maple in the same stand. And no indication that they stop flowing earlier and a little bit of a clue that, no indication that they are, that they behave any differently than sugar maples in the same stand. So that's sort of one half of the study. But when we're talking about total yields, so yes, the total yields from the red and sugar maples in the study were not significantly different. But if some of the beliefs about red maple flavor were true, that would affect how we interpreted the total yields. Because if for some reason they started turning buddy earlier than sugar maple, then those two equal syrup yields that we observed would not actually be equal, because not all of those yields for the red maple would have been grade A syrup. So it's really important to study the flavor aspect of this in order to make sure that our yield data really are the same. And of course, to understand, what red maple syrup flavor is like. So some of the persistent beliefs, like I said, is that that late season off flavor occurs earlier, is more prevalent, or that it's somehow inferior or maybe even somehow better. So the study that we did was simply to answer the question, does the flavor of syrup made from red maple sap differ in any way significantly from that of the syrups made simultaneously from sugar maple sap. And to do this, of course, really all we have to do theoretically is very simple. We just produce syrup simultaneously under identical conditions with pure sugar maple sap and pure red maple sap. So to do that, we had about 500 each sugar and red maple trees in the same stand. It's a little bit hard to see here, but these are two separate main lines. One is for red maples, one is for sugar maples. So they're basically all the trees were co-located, but they were in two different collection systems, but all under the same vacuum system, tapped at the same time. They flowed into two separate sap collection points. And so each time we had a sap flow event with enough sap to work with, we would bring it up immediately up to our processing research facility. And this is the sap. And actually you can see here, something that we noticed right away. So me as a scientist, I am not expecting anything. I'm, just waiting to see what we see. I certainly did not expect to see a visual difference between the two saps. So it's really cool to me that you can very clearly see once it's put all separately together, separately side by side, you can really visually see the difference between the red maple sap and the sugar maple sap. Any guesses from the audience as to which one is which?
I'm going to guess red maple on the right. Right on the right,
yeah. This one here?
Yeah. No, we got a split opinion here.
Well, the other half of you is right. This is the red maple sap. And the left hand side is the red maple and the right hand side is the sugar maple. So yeah, I mean, there are some people in the world that have operations that for one reason or another are split like this and have actually seen it like, oh yeah, of course it's like that. Or if you have like a lot of red maple buckets next to sugar maple buckets, you might have noticed this over time. I thought it was really cool. So once we got all the sap together, we would then concentrate that sap separately to 8% sugar. And this wasn't just important, obviously, that makes the processing experiment more relevant because I shouldn't even say that, but it makes it easier, that's for sure. A lot of syrup is produced using RO. But the really most important reason to do this is because even with that small difference in sap sugar concentration in the raw sap, if we were to process just raw sap, those small differences would mean that the processing times and all the chemistry in those two evaporators would be different from one another. So any difference that we would see in the syrup, then we wouldn't know if it was just because they were processed for a different amount of time. So we had to concentrate them to the same percentage in order to make the conditions in the evaporators equal. So we would concentrate them to 8%. And so here's the sap, like I said, here's the concentrate. So you can see once it's concentrated, it highlights the differences even more. So once we had it all concentrated, each one of those concentrate tanks feeds one of two separate and identical evaporators. The evaporators are set up to process, they're set up identically. So identical sap depth, all their burner adjustment is the same. So the same size nozzles, the same draft, the same draw off settings. And basically we just flood the rigs with their concentrate, start them processing, and then we collect the syrup separately. It's filtered separately, and we basically process it until the supply of concentrate is empty. And then we package the syrup and freeze it for later analysis. And we're able to do this 4 different times during the 22 season. And so here we have our 4 pairs of syrup. Our syrup produced with pure red maple sap across the top and pure sugar maple sap at the same time across the bottom. And so you can see there's like we started on April 4th and our last day was on April 12th. And this is actually really important. We were trying to produce a lot of late season syrup, and our season, basically that April 12th was the day, it was after the peepers were peeping next door to the sugar house. So it was very late in the season, very warm, very challenging. So if we were going to make late season syrup, it definitely would have been on those last 2 days. So that was good for us, and very important for our experimental design. So there's a ton of different things that we could look at with respect to flavor, and a ton of different ways that we can look at the flavor. But fundamentally, the first question we need to answer is the flavor different between the red and sugar maple syrup produced at the same time? And the most sensitive way that we can look at this and answer that question is not with chemical, chemistry equipment. It's actually with human palates and using sensory evaluation experiments. So to do that, we do what's called a triangle test. And this is simply a test. It's very simple. It's designed to answer the question, is there an overall difference in the flavor between two samples? So each panelist gets 3 samples that you can see that they can't see any of the color. They don't know anything about it. And there's a random 3-digit code on the bottle. And within each of that trio, panelists get a different combination of syrups produced on the same day. So say there was pairs of syrup produced on March 18th, they would, some panelists would get 2 of the red maples and 1 of the sugars, or 2 of the sugars and 1 of the reds, and all in different orders. So sugar, sugar, red, sugar, red, you get the idea. It's all mixed up. All the panelists have to do is taste the 3 and identify which one is different from the other 2. So you can see that it's a pretty powerful way to determine if there is a difference between the pair of samples. If enough of the panelists successfully answer which one is correctly different, then you can really confidently say that there is a difference in flavor between the 2. So for this test, or this experiment, we did those triangle tests for 2 of our pairs. The first syrups we made, and that very last late season pair that we made. So we ran this test with 22 non-smokers. We follow all the rules, but basically the general idea is that for a difference to be essentially significant, 12 of the 22 had to correctly identify the odd sample of the trio. And for it to be very significant, 14 of the 22 needed to correctly identify the odd sample. So here are results. And for the first pair of syrups, 13 panelists correctly identified that the odd sample. And so recall that that is just in between just significant and highly significant. So we can say that we can pretty much conclude that there is a detectable difference in flavor between the syrups, the red maple and sugar maple syrup produced on that first date. But for the late season sample, only 9 panelists got it correctly. So this allows us to conclude that there wasn't a difference in flavor between the red and sugar maple sap produced that day, which is really interesting because that means that there's no difference in late season flavor between the red and sugar maple syrup in this study. So gives us a few pieces of interesting information. We know that there's a difference in the flavor of the syrups produced at the beginning, which is interesting. It's not necessarily that there's a huge difference, but there is something different about it. But to not have a difference detected in the last pair, it doesn't mean that there is no difference, but whatever difference might be there is very difficult to detect. But this definitely suggests that there's no increased occurrence of that late season off flavor in red versus sugar maple syrup. And so in order to take a little deeper dive to kind of look at what is the difference that the panelists tasted between the red and sugar maple syrup on the first pair, we're doing some ongoing chemical analyses to see what compounds are present, which aren't, We may do some follow-up sensory analysis also, but stay tuned. We're definitely looking into that. But basically, the sum outcome of this is the yields from red maple are good and not significantly different from sugar maple. And the syrup flavor, although there is a detectable overall difference in flavor, it's likely relatively small, given that it was only detected in that early syrup pair, and no increased occurrence of off flavor. So there is, the basic outcome of this is there is, generally speaking, no reason to pass by a healthy red maple with a roll of tubing. And I have a couple of other things that I can talk about with respect to differences about red maple as we manage it for maple production, but I just wanted to check in and see about time and also questions.
So on time, we've got lots of time.
Oh, perfect.
And any questions here? I do have one myself. So you just dealt with Acer rubrum, red maple. Did you do any, or do you think there's any difference between any of the other soft maples, like silver maple, for instance, or a hybrid between silver and red? Because we've got all of those maples here in Ontario.
Yeah, there are. So the folks at Ohio State have a pretty interesting silver red hybrid that's local to that area, or seems to be local to that area. So they're doing some work experimenting with the hybrid. So I don't, specific to that, there may be data coming. But honestly, we don't have a lot of information on the flavor of any of the other Acer species done in modern equipment like this. So we have some studies from a while ago, where people have batch boiled silver maple, maybe not Norway maple, silver, box elder, and things like that. So, there are some batch boil studies done, but we don't have any studies like this where the syrup was produced in a standard commercial evaporator and tested side by side with another type of syrup, or there are other ways to test the flavor of that, but none have been done on modern equipment.
And other questions? I saw a hand over here. Maybe if you stand in front of the
where the microphone.
no, I think that camera there.
Okay, the camera has a microphone.
Oh, hey there, I can see you.
You can see, yeah. Question about you look at flavor from I think it was April 4th and April 12th, I believe. Anyway, was the April 12th off flavor?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Maybe you could stand where Wayne is.
Okay. Wayne is actually Eric.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So you heard
stand there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
I can hear a little better from that side.
The question is, the last the samples from the very last day that you tested flavor, were those in any sense off flavored? Like, were they both buddy, for example?
Oh, right. So objectively, they were, how should I describe this? Objectively, they were late season, but not buddy.
Okay, so, yeah, all right. Okay, and also I'd be curious about I guess you don't have data for early season, but there was a difference, a noticeable difference, sort of mid, late, but early maybe to be even a greater difference or a lesser difference, or did we have anything about that?
Well, we didn't compare the flavor of the early season to the late season, but generally it was just the typical progression of maple syrup from early to late.
Yeah,
So
maybe I didn't ask the question clearly.
well, you might have asked it perfectly clearly. I'm just not hearing super well.
Oh, okay, so yeah, the question is there a statistical difference in the flavors of early season between red and sugar?
There was no significant difference between the flavor of the early season syrup.
Okay, so that's another test that you did, but you didn't present that, I guess. Is that right? Because I think
Yes, there was. But It seems that Zoom has just quit. Hang on a second. Can you still see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
There you go.
Good, because Zoom just said that it crashed. Okay. Yeah, no, there was a significant difference between the pair produced, the earliest pair that we produced, which was actually fairly early season for us. We missed a few of the late March runs, but this is pretty early in the season, and it was not a hugely big difference, and it's hard for me to tell you objectively what the nature of that difference was. So that's why we're going to look at, we'll do some additional analyses to try and assess what the nature of that difference was.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I guess I'd be curious about, there's only 8 days difference between those two tests, and I presume the season was like at least 3 or 4 weeks long. So is there some data from, say, Vermont?
Yeah, we missed a few of the very early season runs, but for us at the Proctor Center, really, I mean, while we may tap in February, really the significant runs don't come until the 3rd week of March. So while this isn't early season, this is pretty representative of the season, of the early parts of the season, I would say.
Another question at the back. If you maybe ask and I'll repeat it.
Yeah. So my question is that have you looked into the longevity of the red maple versus the sugar maple once you start tapping it? And also,
yes, fantastic question. And that segues into, I have a couple more slides. So why don't I do those, and then we'll pick up the questions since we do have time, because that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So with red maple, the flavor is similar, the yields are similar, but they're obviously very different trees in some ways than sugar maple. So one thing to consider when managing and tapping red maple, just like your question or beginning to answer the question that you just asked, is that they do have tendency to have these large central columns of discolored wood. So this is similar to like a tap hole stain. This is totally non-conductive. But when we see this can be a pretty common phenotype to have in red maples, especially in wet area. It tends to develop in trees that were multi-stem to begin with in life, and that are slow growing. So one thing in terms of managing for sap yields is that this means that for red maples, especially when we know they have this phenotype, obviously you're going to need to be cautious with tapping depth. I don't like to prescribe a universally shallower depth for red maples because not all red maples have this. But it's something to kind of be aware of if you're noticing the brown wood chips when you're tapping in an area of red maple, or if you've done some silviculture and you know that there's other reds in that area with this big central column, it might be a good idea to back off tapping depth. And overall, when we do see people that have observations that are like, yeah, these red maples don't have the yield as my sugar, it is possible that it could be from red maples that have this trait, because clearly there's a lot less conductive sapwood in a tree like this than if this was almost entirely clear, like it might be in a sugar maple. So that's just something to think about. And sort of related to this, I'll get to the wounding later, but just one other thing that people often, we see red maples start to get active before sugar maples. And it's just, I think, important or good to point out that what we're seeing in the spring, develop when when the buds start to get active. It's actually the floral buds of red maple. The vegetative or leaf buds of red maple they actually leaf out later than sugar maple slightly. So that's just kind of something to be aware of. And as far as the non-conductive wood that's generated or in response to tap hole injury in red maple, my former colleague, Tim Wilmot, did a study looking at that. We have a good amount of data on sugar maple, but at that time we didn't have a lot on red. And what he found is that if tap holes are made into clear conductive wood in red maple, that the total volume of non-conductive wood generated in response to that wound is similar to the volume generated in response to a wound in sugar maple. However, there are a couple different things about red maple that make that equation not always equal. Red maples are soft maple, so they are breaky, and probably owing in part to that, they tend to just have they can have quite a bit of non-conductive wood already present, either from that central column, like I was just talking about, from branch scars because they do break a lot. And so anytime a tap hole wound is sort of adjacent to or nearby one of those pre-existing areas of non-conductive wood, they tend to interact and make much larger amounts of non-conductive wood. So this is something also to think about when it comes to the tapping longevity of red maple. It may, in some red maples, may be more challenging to find conductive wood after a time. But if there are good growth rates, and red maples can have really stunningly good growth rates, that can counterbalance that, because that tree with good growth rates is, of course, adding more conductive wood faster to replenish that non-conductive wood. Okay, and something we see a lot we see a lot of bark fissures in smooth bark red maple. And one thing that Tim Wilmot looked at was, egads, what's that doing to the inside of the tree? And he actually found that generally speaking, those are superficial, and that didn't translate into more non-conductive wood on the inside. And sort of also getting to your question, like a red maple, if we're going to manage stands for red maple, this is a completely different process, or a somewhat different process than managing it for sugar maple. They're two different species. They have different lifespans, different needs for regeneration, and they obviously have different longevity, and they do break. So there, of people that I know that have a lot of soft maples in their woods are like, I spend more time repairing tubing, because every time there's a storm, more stuff falls on the ground, things like that. So there's some things to think about, but generally speaking, as far as the sustainability for tapping red maples in the long term, because we know that there's no greater wound response in red maple if it's into clear wood, then the same rules apply as for sugar maple. As long as the growth rate and health of those trees, and the health, of course, is just determining the growth rate, as long as the growth rate is good and the tree is healthy, it should be sufficient to be able to tap that tree over the long term, sustainably, finding good conductive sapwood for good yields and good healthy trees. So that hopefully that got to your question, but if it didn't, I can add more.
Okay, thank you, Abby. Any other questions from the group here? Just a show of hands, how many people have red maple in their bush? And so we've got about 2/3 of the crowd with red maple. And of those, do you guys tap red maple? Or we have about 20% of the people that do have red maple that are tapping them.
So has anyone changed their mind that doesn't tap red maple? Or is anyone converted today and going home to add some taps?
I don't know if Brian's got a question or he's a conversion.
Both. Growing up, we have sugar maple and red maple kind of together. The neighbor, who was one of the best sugar makers in the county, always swore that his best syrup came when he tapped his sugar maple in the uplands and also his red maple in the lowlands. And I can remember as a kid, before I even started school, being terrified riding on this gathering sleigh with water up over the bunks that he insisted on going through to gather from these trees. But he was known to have the best syrup around that whole area. And I always remember when I went off to forestry school and reading the literature, the first thing I read about was about the different species. And there it was saying, you know, stay away from red maple because it's not as good. And that really conflicted with this sort of naturalized local knowledge that said, no, you need to blend that in. And years ago, we had a lot of sugar bushes around us that were based solely on red maple because that's all they had. And people
Right.
made their syrup. And there was really not much differentiation made. So anyway, just a point.
Yeah.
And
No.
yes, I probably will not avoid red maples in the stand based on some of this.
Well, that's great to hear. And that anecdote is very similar to what I hear over and over again. You know, both we obviously have producers that we know that they have red maple, so that's what they tap. So that just is what it is. But there are also lots of producers, especially over time, that have sworn up and down that having that addition of the red maple was really important to flavor. Yeah, I'll be interested to be able to add some more information about the fundamentals differences that we saw. I can tell, you know, non-objectively or subjectively that it was a very slight difference, but it was noticeable.
One more question, Abby?
So my
Sure.
last question is, like, we're pretty far north, and so in June we had a freeze in the low-lying areas got to -3. And so when I walked around, I saw significantly more leaf damage on the red maples versus the sugar maples, and I don't know if that is a risk with them or not. It's just something I've observed.
Yeah, I don't know that they tend to be, that they have any less freeze intolerance than sugar maple. Like when we have a late season frost or freeze like that, it's possible on the root sides of things. Maybe, I don't know. I know that for us, like, well, you know what? I'm gonna say I don't know because I just don't know. I don't really think there would be difference between the two, but I really don't know.
Maybe very quick, we got a
Very quick. I just came at the end. Have you looked at silver maple yet?
We asked that question. Yeah.
No, no, not in this study.
Okay, Abby, thank you very much. It worked out very well having you on remote. But next year, we hope to see you in person or at some point in the future. And thanks for all the research that you do at Proctor and University of Vermont. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and I will see you guys soon.